Welcome to the 2010 Sydney Writers' Festival. My name's Ashley Hay, and in a former life I was the literary editor of the now-defunct Bulletin magazine. It was a nice job. I got to read lots of things. And most of them, however fabulous, tended to slip back to the sort of dusty shelving of my mind after a while. But there's one thing that I do remember reading so clearly during those years. I can still remember where I was sitting, and I can remember what it felt like when I read the words for the first time and they became, I guess, part of my world. And that was an essay that Bill McKibben had written for an issue of Granta themed around this overheating world. Bill talked about the snows of Kilimanjaro, and he talked about permafrost. He talked about our urgent need for a new understanding of time and space against the kind of misconception that we have that everything around here moves so slowly and so imperceptibly that we can pretty much do what we like in front of its backdrop. For 15 years, he said, some small percentage of the world's scientists and diplomats and activists has inhabited one of those strange dreams where the dreamer desperately needs to warn someone about something bad and imminent, but somehow, no matter how hard he shouts, the other person can't hear him. And I was astonished to realise when I went back and reread that the other day that it was published 7 years ago now, back in 2003. So the call's still going out for us to embrace new ways of behaving, of living, of getting and spending and being. And I think that Bill's new book, Earth, with 2 A's to remind us that it's not the planet we used to live on, is going to prove an important part of us learning about these things. I'd like to thank you all for coming and get some housekeeping out of the way, mostly to say, can you please make sure you've turned off everything that beeps and rings. I've asked Bill if he'd read a little bit from his new book, and then we'll have a chat about it and about his other work and about the organisations Step It Up and 350.org and the work that he's involved with through them. We will have time at the end for some questions, and there are some microphones that will come around for that. Given that we've only got an hour for Bill, I'd ask if you could please make your question a question and make it kind of brief and clear. That would be fantastic. After the session, Bill will be signing books at the Glee Books shop downstairs. So, if we can talk first a little bit about Bill McKibben, and Earth, making life on a tough new planet. Bill is an American environmentalist and writer whose 1989 book, The End of Nature, was the first book about climate change that was written for a lay audience. It's now been reprinted in more than 20 languages. His later books include Deep Economy, The Wealth of Communities and the Durable Future, and Maybe One, about human population and the ecological arguments for smaller families. His writings appeared in publications including The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, Mother Jones, and the New York Review of Books. In the introduction to his latest book, Earth, he writes simply and perhaps even plaintively, we need to understand the world we've created and consider urgently how to live in it. We can't simply keep stacking boulders against the change that's coming on every front. We'll need to figure out what parts of our lives and our ideologies we must abandon so that we can protect the core of our societies and our civilisations. There's nothing airy or speculative about this conversation. It's got to be uncomfortable, staccato and direct. I'd like to start now, though, by asking him to read a little from this new book, and then we can begin today's conversation.
Well, thank you very much for that very gracious introduction. Let me read it just a little bit from the, since it's the Writers' Festival, I thought I'd read a little sort of literary discussion almost from halfway through the book, once we've gotten through the really ominous discussions of exactly what's going on the planet and are beginning the conversation about what sort of habits we might need in order to inhabit the planet we've now built. A conversation that I think is difficult because we lack the words for it. We've spent so long convinced that growth is the answer to every problem that we face, that it's become our sort of mantra, that our language is stunted in this regard. So we lack the vocabulary and the metaphors we need for life on a different scale. We're so used to growth that we can't imagine alternatives. At best, we embrace the squishy sustainable with its implied claim that we can keep on as before. So here are my candidates for words that may help us think usefully about the future. Durable, sturdy, stable, hardy, robust. These are squat, solid, stout words that conjure a world where we no longer grow by leaps and bounds, but where we hunker down, where we dig in. They are words that we associate with maturity, not youth, with steadiness, not flash. They aren't exciting, but they are comforting. Think husband, not boyfriend. Our time has been marked by ever-increasing speed. Paddle wheeler to locomotive to airplane to rocket, Model T to Formula One. Can you imagine slower? Maybe so. The slow food movement has spread steadily around the world for a decade. Our time's been marked by great ups and downs, booms with the occasional bust. Can you imagine steadiness? Can you make it work in your mind? Most of all, of course, our time has been the time of bigness, the amazing, ever-steepening upward curve where things grew and then grew some more. Economies and road networks and houses inflating until there were entire subdivisions filled with starter castles for entry-level monarchs. Stomachs and breasts and lips, cars and debts, portions and bonuses. Can we imagine smaller? That's the test of our time, both practical and psychological. How can we adjust to the fact that we're not going to get bigger? It's not easy to make the imaginative leap. Slow food is one thing, but shrinking is another. The pain of the recession, a word that after all literally means getting smaller, has been entirely real because our economy is geared to work only with growth. By definition, the only way to escape recession is to grow larger again. On the other hand, in certain ways, our economic trouble gives us real insight into scale, makes it easier to start thinking subversive thoughts. If there is a phrase that sticks in the mind and in the craw from the last few years, it is too big to fail. Giants like Citibank or AIG had swelled to a size where if they collapsed, they could bring down the entire financial system. The phrase, loosely translated, meant the government must bail us out. But the simpler meaning of the phrase was that they were too big. Anything too big to fail is by definition too big. And of course, it turns out that, in a sense, banks are the least of the problem in this regard. If you want to find systems that are really too big to fail and yet in the process of failing, agriculture and energy are probably the first two places to really try to look.
One of the things that strikes me about the book is that it is beautifully written. It's not a happy story that you're telling in a lot of ways, but it's the language is often quite beautiful. The metaphors are quite stunning. The images are quite stunning. Is it an odd place to live as a writer to sit between this story that you're telling, this story that you've been telling for quite some time now, and the sort of the creative drive to make it into the story?
For a very long time, I think my work has been about trying to figure out what set of words, images, ideas are able to communicate what's a very large and difficult to communicate truth. Some of that's the simple act of scientific translation, knowing the science well enough to be able to make it easily comprehensible. And for a while, I was the only person doing that, and happily now there are lots of people like Tim Flannery here who are doing remarkably adept job of that same sort of thing. But there's also this task of metaphor. In a sense, the search for a new energy supply is only slightly more urgent than the search for a new metaphor to allow us to grapple in our minds with what this, what the kind of world we're going to need to build is, and what its compensations and beauties will be, because the transition away from fossil fuel, from the core of our economy, will be wrenching, But the world on the other side needn't necessarily be a dire place. There are some compensating beauties that I try to get at in the last half of this book.
And it is a book which does leave you optimistic somehow, which I think is a remarkable achievement for a book in this area. But it does give you that sense that that there are. The scale of the problem is so large, it's easy to sort of shut down in front of it, and that this gives you the sense of things that you can start thinking about doing, and that there is something on the other side, that it's not an unknown abyss, this new planet.
So we need, action in two regards. And one of them, and the one in a sense that's most interesting to me intellectually, is trying to figure out how we build strong local communities and economies that persist in the face of what's going to be some tough weather, as it were, for the next few centuries. The Holocene is over. The planet, the stable, benign regime that lasted for the first 10,000 years of human civilization is now upended, and it's going to get topsier yet. But if we build stable, resilient, sturdy communities and relocalize parts of our economies, we may be able to do okay if we also do the other task of figuring out how to bring the emission of carbon into the atmosphere under some kind of control. I mean, so far we've raised the temperature 1 degree. We've got another degree in the pipeline from carbon we've already emitted. That's what's causing the poles to melt. It's made the oceans 30% more acid. It's put fire, the atmosphere, everything around us is 5% moister than it was 40 years ago. That's an almost astonishing change in a basic physical parameter. That's with 1 degree of temperature rise. The climatologists are very clear that we're going to get, unless we make this transition quickly, 5, 6, 7 degrees. Man, you can be the best organic gardener in the world, and if it rains every day for 40 days, you're, as Noah found, out of luck.
Well, you need an ark at that point.
That's all. That's the last resort, I think.
Putting aside the fact that there are still people who, don't believe or don't want to believe in the kind of world of anthropogenic climate change, what do you think needs to happen for most people to have that moment of epiphany that you've had, that they're not living on the planet that they're familiar with, they're not living on that, sweetest of sweet spots? And what do you think will happen as more people do start actively realising that?
I think that for many people, that realisation is already inchoate in their minds. The real limitation is to sort of thinking it through, and is the sense that there's nothing to be done about it.
Yeah.
That what can I, as a one person or whatever, do about this? And that's a very acute perception, and it's why we've started in the last couple of years. I've started trying to organize, with some success, this huge global climate change campaign, to give people, along with the work they're doing in their communities, some overarching political framework for it that's large enough to potentially make a difference, to change the odds of the outcome being different. And that work's been very satisfying, because it turns out that there are millions upon millions of people literally all over the world who are willing and even eager to get in the fight once they see that there's a fight underway. That's the hard part, is people sense that there's no point engaging because there's no point of engagement.
Can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
350.org and Step It Up, and just how they came about, I guess, and
Sure.
some of there are some fabulous stories that have come out of them.
Well, I mean, in a sense, I kick myself hard for not having figured out that 20 years ago that what we needed was a kind of movement. I think people trusted for a long time, who were worried about this, that because it was the biggest problem the world had ever faced, that it would be enough for scientists to tell us the problem, and policy people and economists and engineers to tell us the solution, and then the political powers that be would go to work. But it turns out what do you know? That's not how politics works.
Was that also partly because we had gone through, there's always that comparison between the hole in the ozone layer. That was a thing. That was one thing. There were things we knew we could do.
That's right.
And that people had the sense that, here's the next problem.
And that
we'll
was a very technical problem with a very fairly easy solution. And our political, it was Ronald Reagan who said, yes, we'll sign this protocol and whatever. Yeah, maybe that was part of it. Well, that didn't happen here, and it didn't happen for an obvious reason. Fossil fuel is the most profitable enterprise human beings have ever undertaken, and hence there's an enormous vested interest in preventing action or delaying it, which is the same thing in this case. So at a certain point a few years ago, I just began to think, well, we've got to build an actual movement around America. It's where we started 3 years ago with a thing we called Step It Up that we held, when I say we, me and 6 undergraduates at Middlebury where I teach, we managed to organize somehow 1,400 rallies across the country on one day in all 50 states. And a couple of days later, both Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, then running for president, embraced the demand that we'd put forward of an 80% cut in carbon emissions by 2050. So we were quite impressed with ourselves, I must say. The only problem was that 6 weeks later in the summer of '07, the Arctic began to melt. And by the time it was done melting, it was very clear, A, that our targets were out of date. What happens in 2050 is of scant interest compared to what happens in 2020.
2020, yeah.
And it was also very clear that the proper unit for thinking about this was not one light bulb at a time, and it wasn't even one country at a time. It was going to have to be one planet at a time. In January of '08, Jim Hansen and his team at NASA, the sort of foremost climatological team in the world, put out a paper saying, we know enough now from paleoclimatic observation and from looking at what's happening in the real world like the Arctic, to be able to tell finally what the number is, the drop-dead line. And that number, really the most important number in the world, is 350 parts per million CO2. Any value greater than that, they said, in quite a literate and quite a scary turn of phrase for scientists in the abstract of their first paper, any value for carbon greater than that is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. Strong language. Very strong language when you know that we're well past it at 390 parts per million now. Which is why, the Arctic is melting. It's why the suburbs of Melbourne catch on fire after the hottest, driest weather ever recorded. It's why, as of today, we've just determined that the January to April period was the warmest January to April period in the planet's history, and it's now apparently almost certain that 2010 will be the warmest calendar year on record, on and on and on. We decided to take that number 350 and try to organize with it. It wasn't an obvious choice because it's a kind of obscure scientific data point. It's not like an inspiring slogan. On the other hand, it has the virtue of holding politicians to an actual standard. It's not telling them we need action on global warming. It's telling them how much we need. And two, it has the virtue of Arabic numerals translate across linguistic boundaries. So happily, 350 means the same thing in Sydney and Shanghai, We set to work. By this time, there were 7 undergraduates, and they're now had graduated. There were 23. 7 was a good number because there are 7 continents. So each one took one. The guy who took the Antarctic took the internet too. It's sort of its own continent. And we went to work, and we didn't have any money. We didn't have any, but we did start finding people like ourselves all over the world. Many of them young, a lot of them involved in different faith communities. Farmers, people working in human rights, people working in health, public health, just all around the world. And we asked people as a kind of initial thing to take October 24th of 2009 as the kind of day of action, and to do something that took that 350 number and made it real. Now, we'd gathered in New York for the week beforehand in a couple of borrowed, dingy offices downtown with our laptops to kind of watch the results as it were come in. And we didn't really know what was going to happen. We would hope that we'd done a good job, but it was, global organizing is a hard business. As it turned out, we'd done our job well. And on October 24th, there were 5,200 simultaneous rallies in 181 countries, pretty much all the countries there are except North Korea, And CNN said it was the most widespread day of political action on any issue in the planet's history. It was very beautiful. There were 240 of these in Australia, including a completely wonderful big human 350 on the steps of the Opera House with several thousand people. That was really an image that, given Australia's chronological precedence in the world, we managed to shoot around the planet before most people were getting up, and it was a big inspiration and help. It was quite powerful. One of the things it demonstrated, and you can go look at the 25,000 pictures in our Flickr account at 350.org, one of the things it demonstrated was that this old idea that environmentalism is something for rich white people who have solved their other problems is a canard. Most of the people in those pictures are black, brown, Asian, poor, young, because that's what most of the world is. And, what do you know? They're just to care just as much. We have a file of 300 pictures that are just women in full burqa holding demonstrations in Yemen or Saudi Arabia or Iran or wherever else. On and on and on around the world. We got to Copenhagen 6 weeks later. The number was on everyone's lips, which was good. We had a great church service at the cathedral that Desmond Tutu came to preach the service, and then they rang the bell at the cathedral 350 times, and then thousands of churches around the world did the same thing that day. We got 117 nations to sign on to this 350 target, which was pretty great. But they were the wrong 117 nations. There's an almost inverse relationship in this planet between how much of the problem you cause and how quickly you feel the result. And so these are the people who are already getting hammered, the poorest and most vulnerable countries. The richest and most addicted, led by the U.S., not yet willing to face reality. And so on we go. October 10th is the next big day in this thing, 10-10-10, so no excuse for forgetting the date. And it'll be a global work party this time. And in thousands of communities around the world, people will be putting up solar panels, digging community gardens, laying out bike paths, all kind of useful things, back to sort of my conception of the kind of local action that we are going to need for communities to thrive, but also with a very pointed political message for our leaders, which is, we're getting to work, maybe you could too. If I can climb up on the roof and hammer in a solar panel, you could climb onto the floor of the Senate and hammer out a little legislation, And we need to, I'm afraid, do a certain amount of shaming at this point in order to and, the things that politicians get ashamed of. Going into a gay bar should not be grounds for losing your job. Failing to address the biggest problem that humans have ever faced should be grounds for losing your job.
I wanted to come back just to the James Hansen paper and the 350 parts per million. It's one of the most profound points in the book, partly because 350.org does grow out of it. But just, it's, as you say, it's sort of an obscure number. It's a little, it's a data point. Can I ask what your sense of reading that research was? He was saying anything beyond 350 is unworkable. You knew, because you're sort of across this issue, that we were already, 380, 390 parts per million, and that even if every government in the world did absolutely everything it had talked about doing, we would still reach 725 parts per million.
At the moment, there's much that governments could do to, there's much more that they could be doing, and we're not, even if we did everything right at this point, young people will be elderly before we get back to 350. It takes a long time for oceans and forests to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere. It's still within the realm of possibility that we could do that. Much damage would be done in the meantime, but maybe not sort of civilization-challenging scale of damage. But that would require far nimbler action than so far anybody has shown any sign of taking. That's why we do the kind of organizing that we do. When Hansen, Jim is an old friend, when he told me what the number was, my heart, of course, sank. At some level, intellectually, I knew that we were already, knew enough to know that we were already into the red zone because, hell, the Arctic's melting. What does that tell you, But he was as sort of abashed by the number as I was. It's not good news, except that it's helpful to know things, I was very worried when we started that it was going to be such a depressing number that it would make organizing difficult, that people would throw up their hand, we're already past it, we can't do it. Turns out that was a misperception on my part, and the opposite is true. It's been more like if you go to the doctor, and the doctor says, someday, if you keep eating like this, your cholesterol will be too high. What do you do in return?
Well, nothing.
Nothing, yes. But if the doctor says, whoa, your cholesterol's in the zone where people have heart attacks all the time. I think you may already have had a small stroke, Time to get your cholesterol down, and what do you do then? That's the day that you start, go buy running shoes and, vegetarian cookbooks and whatever else, That turns out to be how people have reacted to this, the sense that it's real, that it's not our grandchildren who are at risk, it's right now. That's been very useful.
And in terms, like you say, that it's helpful to know things, and given that we're sitting at a writers' festival discussing this, I wanted to talk a little bit about just the role of the literature around this. I can remember in the Granta essay that you spoke about the failure of people sort of taking on the breadth of the problem as partly being an imaginative or an artistic failure, because responses to global warming hadn't produced an Orwell or a Huxley. There was no On the Beach, there was no Dr. Strangelove. In the new book, you write about this lovely new genre that we have called collapse porn, which I'm sure Jared Diamond would love to know he was part of. Can you talk a little bit about just how stories have been important in getting the message out, or how they, may be more important in the future?
I think the reason that it took a while was that we've spent 10,000 years with the main dramatic action being conflicts between people. That's been what's moved the story along, That's been the kind of interesting and important thing to get a handle on. And so it was harder for artists to understand that the single biggest conflict that we face at the moment is between human beings and physics and chemistry, that's going to be the dramatic tension that we're unwinding for the century to come if we step up to the task at all. And happily, people are beginning to do that in all kinds of ways. There now are operas, and having written that piece for Granta, I must say, every amateur poet in the world felt it necessary to email me their poem about climate change. Just to prove that they were hard at work on it. But there are now a lot of very good poems, librettos, documentaries. Since then, Al Gore sort of redefined the documentary genre with the very powerful, inconvenient truth. And there is, real literature starting to get. My friend Margaret Atwood, I think, is really on the forefront of writing that hits home in a different way on some of this. And we need more of it. We need a lot of artistic involvement in the kind of political fight too. But it has to be the problem is that we have a very short period of time to accomplish what needs accomplishing. And so that's one of the reasons we've pushed this 350 meme, so hard. We've tried to get a lot of artists with some success really behind. If you look at those pictures from October 24th, you'll see that it was an enormous public art project at some level. We also had lots of writers wonderfully agreeing to write 350-word essays and short stories and poems and whatever else that people found great fun. Environmentalists spent too long appealing. I can never remember which side of the brain is the creative, and environmentalists spent a long time appealing to whatever the side of the brain is that really likes pie charts and bar graphs and things. Yep. That has its use, but it's been very important for us to bring arts, faith, food, the senses, because those are ways into the more visceral hopes, fears, dreams of people, which to get change on the scale we're going to need is what we have to mobilize, not just our intellects, I think.